Hi, welcome to this video for next week's class. Uh, I want to begin by just very briefly reviewing, the slide was up quite a bit last time. Um, just to state that, yes, there are currently recognized 10 personality disorders, narcissistic personality disorder being one of those. The DSM puts in this cluster B. There's good scientific data the last 5 years or so to strongly suggest that these clusters are incorrect, and whether or not the data will have or when the data will have an impact on how the psychiatric clinical psych community views the distinction between different personality disorders is something that, that I don't have an answer for, and I don't think anybody does at this point. And there's still room and need for much more data on the topic. Um, so we do want to be able to classify narcissism. There are a number of reasons for this. One is that it provides a consistency in terms of what is it? What is this disorder? What does it consist of? Um, how can we predict individuals' behavior, short term, long term? What's the prognosis for this disorder? The more that we're able to well define um, the precise symptoms that make up this precise disorder, the better we'll be able to do those things. So it has a much benefit in terms of the individual. It has much benefit in terms of potential treatments, in large part because it has much benefit in terms of being able to define better research in the area. Um, the poor reliability within the personality disorders and within the symptomology of NPD and MN, makes it difficult to do research. If you're looking at a trait that would correlate well with symptoms of narcissism, and those symptoms are variable depending on which lab, which clinician, which journal editors, et cetera, describe the disorder as which um, basket of symptoms. It makes it difficult to do really good research. So it's very important that we come to a consensus as a field in terms of um, clinical psychologists, psychiatrists, cognitive neuroscientists, in terms of what the real symptomology is for this disorder. So again, personality disorders are a disordered personality. It's a lifelong core trait. Core traits that, that are part of our core personality. I'll go over this more in a moment. There's a high genetic contribution. There's a high what's called heritability. Heritability is the amount of variance in a trait that can be attributed to genetic factors. So there's a pretty high genetic contribution to NPD. The studies have been done show that it's in the order of 0.6, 0.65, up around there, and that's relatively high. Most behavioral traits show a heritability somewhere between 0.25 and 0.75. The average is around 0.5s, suggesting that things are about half genetic, half environmental, which is what you might expect after some point of study in the broad arena of behavior. So those characteristics, those behaviors that have a higher than 0.5 heritability are are considered to be fairly strongly genetic in origin. So pathological narcissism, pathological narcissism is one of those characteristics. So it does have a fairly high genetic um, basis. There is a difference here between personality disorders and other disorders. And I touched upon this in last Tuesday's class. Most disorders, everything about us, as I just mentioned, has some type of genetic and environmental contribution. Heart disease. People are born with different genetic risks for heart disease. But the actually expressing the disease ends up being the result of that person's lifestyle, i.e. their environment and experiences. So someone can have a high predisposition towards heart disease and never develop heart disease because they have a healthy lifestyle in a number of different ways. Someone can have a very relatively low genetic predisposition but develop heart disease because of their poorer lifestyle choices. Okay, so predisposition is the extent to which you are more likely than not to experience a particular, in this case, we're talking about disorders, based on your environmental, on your experiences, on your environment. Okay, now, people have different predispositions to behavioral disorders as well. Depression. Some people have a higher predisposition toward being depressed than others. So triggering events, loss of a loved one, loss of a job, negative events in one's life are more likely to trigger depression in those that have a higher predisposition. Dealing with COVID, has triggered depression in a significant number of individuals. There's a difference in how this pandemic, affects individuals, each person somewhat differently. On average, there's been an increase in population levels of depression and anxiety. But within each individual, their response to the situation then depends on their predispositions to stressors, different types of stressors, what stressors develop in their lives, how the pandemic has affected relationships, or the ability to see loved ones, to travel, or their job, financial security, all sorts of factors. Okay, so people are predisposed differentially. There are large differences in predisposition towards substance use disorders, alcohol use disorder, various drugs, gambling, etc. If one parent of an individual has been clinically diagnosed with any substance use disorder, the predisposition risk for that individual is about 40%, compared to a population, broad population predisposition of between 5 and 10%, depending on which studies you look at. If an individual has both parents who are clinically diagnosed with a substance use disorder, that risk predisposition goes up to 70%. Now, that doesn't mean that individual will become an alcoholic or a heroin addict, such things. But if exposed to any of those substances in those situations, that person's risk is substantially higher than someone who does not have that familial genetic-based risk. Okay, so that's predisposition. Core personality is different in that an individual may have a wonderful, optimistic, outgoing personality, but because of environmental events, triggers an episode of depression that, as I mentioned in class, sort of gets layered on top of their core personality. The personality disorders like narcissism can get triggered, but not in the same sense. It's more that they get developed. So it is there. It is part of their core personality. Those traits are there as part of their innate personality. So they don't get triggered in that sense that they appear. It's more that they get developed to different extents depending on their environment, their circumstances, their experiences. So someone who doesn't have that genetic susceptibility, that genetic core, is really not predisposed towards becoming a narcissist, a pathological narcissist. Okay? A pathological narcissist is born with a core personality of a narcissist, like an optimist, an extrovert, introvert, what have you. Narcissist is a core personality. NPD then is forged by the developmental environment. Typically, we see this in terms of parenting styles. Malignant narcissism then gets triggered. I like the word enabled because it's a severe form of NPD by the individual circumstance. Their acquisition or their stumbling into positions of power, wealth, fame, where the malignant aspects of narcissism are allowed, are enabled, are allowed to surface and be expressed. So, classifying narcissism related to personality. There have been a number of models of personality, or theories about personality. What vectors, what dimensions can we use to describe personality? What sorts of terms? What groups of traits make up a person's core personality? The model that has now been used the most and is most widely accepted is this 5-factor model that is typically known as the Big Five. And it becomes a little bit easy to remember what the Big Five are, consists of. With the mean one you see is canoe. This one says ocean, OCEAN, ocean. The 5 dimensions are openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which is emotional stability or instability. Okay. So let's look at these for a minute and see if they fit the narcissist. Openness. Someone who's prefers routine, is very practical. Not really. Someone who's imaginative, variety, independence, and much more open, sort of versus closed. How much openness? Again, not necessarily. I mean, you can see it both ways. Conscientiousness. Impulsiveness, pathological narcissists would tend to be um, much more impulsive, certainly, less conscientious about things because so have less of a conscience, if you will. Not careful, not well disciplined unless that discipline is very self-serving. Okay, not for the sake of being disciplined for some situation, only disciplined in respect that it is self-serving and beneficial to the individual. Certainly um, more disorganized and impulsive. Extroversion, introversion. Um, These narcissists are typically not very fun-loving, affectionate. You, again, their external behaviors are a mask. It's a false self that doesn't allow for affectionate behaviors. Doesn't allow for sociable behaviors because that might disrupt the mask a bit. It's best to keep a distance, even in relationships. So if they seem like they're very affectionate or intimate, again, it's self-serving and manipulative and only a benefit to the self and not to any other. At the same time, are they sober and reserved? Not in the sense that we usually think of those words. Sober and reserved in terms of presenting that false self. That false self is, isn't necessarily a party animal, very sociable, outgoing. Agreeableness. Here we come into real narcissism possibilities. Ruthless, suspicious, low on the agreeableness scale. Okay, again, these are all scales. Are you more this way, more that way? High on the agreeableness scale? No. Soft-hearted? Definitely not. Trusting? No. Narcissists would tend to be very paranoid. Helpful? If it's self-serving, but typically not, since they're the best and they're the greatest, they would expect people to be helpful towards them. And finally, emotional stability versus instability. Calm, secure, and self-satisfied? I don't think so. Even the mask, the false self, does not portray itself as being extraordinarily secure. The security, is really false. And if you watch it, you can see through it and see the insecurity underneath it. These people really are underneath the surface, very anxious, insecure, self-pitying. So the grandiosity, the lack of empathy, I have to be the best, I have to be the best. Anything that might imply that they're not, oh, woe is me, it's their fault. It's always the fault of the other who's trying to attack them. So these last two, really portray more strongly characteristics of the narcissist. There are a number of studies of the big five and narcissism, and people have developed additional scales for narcissism as sort of subtypes of the big five model, things like that. There are a few of them, maybe yes, maybe no. So I'm not going to go into that in any detail at all, other than to let you know that studying these, one can look at them and go, well, yes, but here we see, some traits that can be part of the narcissistic personality. But the other combinations, or there's subscales that we can tease out on neuroticism that would apply towards defining a narcissist versus a non-narcissist. So then, narcissistic, gosh darn it, narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. There are a number of symptoms, right? We typically think of these individuals as, showing this just pervasive grandiosity. It doesn't matter the situation, the topic, I'm the best, I have the best, I know more, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, regardless of the situation. There are other types of narcissism. This would be more in line with overt narcissism, the very strong grandiosity. Covert narcissism tends to express, those individuals tend to express lower levels of grandiosity. They all express a lack of empathy. Some studies, have tried to dissociate, empathy itself from the narcissism. And that may be a bit of, with the saying, splitting hairs, certainly for the sake of this class and for an understanding of the foundations of narcissism and pathological narcissism, it's very safe to say that these individuals display a lack of empathy, lack of empathetic behaviors, and a need for admiration. These tend to be like the big three. Need for admiration. I need to be out in front of a crowd. I need people to be, cheering for me and just there, adoring me. The looks in their eyes, the intensity of their feelings. I can feel, I can get that narcissistic supply that I need to feed that addiction. You see that in a lot of entertainers that have to be in the limelight, red carpets, have to go on tour. There are some people that shutting things down for COVID was just horrible because they need that supply of the drug from the crowd. My experience in that industry, I still remember the attraction of that crowd drug, the energy, the pervasiveness of that energy, walking on the stage and seeing a crowd of several thousand people. It's a drug, and I would say, given all that history, I was very fortunate not to succumb to drugs. In fact, one of the reasons I went into neuroscience and addiction was to try and figure out, why not me? Since there were so many drugs around, I had so many colleagues that succumbed to the allure, and who were just as addicted to the crowds as they were to cocaine. So yeah, there is an allure there. There is a drug. I can testify to somebody like, I don't know, pick your favorite, rock star, celebrity, Donald Trump, needing that adoration, of the crowd. I think Donald Trump sort of expresses it very overtly, and has had the power, the resources to be able to just call on it. I'm the president, I will travel here and there will be a crowd because I have a need for that. If the arenas or whatever, got shut down, well, that band couldn't play that arena. And well, those people didn't get their drug. Okay. Now add on to that. Look at that type of individual. Now add on to that, and you don't see this with hardly ever with celebrities, entertainers. Sadism. It's almost another addiction. A joy, a pleasure from seeing others suffer. Most of us just cannot understand that. Remember when I said in class about how many times did I say, oh, you don't get it. You're not a sadist. I hope, don't receive pleasure watching someone else suffer. The sadist truly does. They get off on it. It's another source of supply to them. Watching someone suffer is another source of supply. Sociopathy. That lack of empathy. Hey, wow, it's a shame that they died. Whatever. I guess it's a shame because people think it's a shame. All right. Doesn't affect me. Doesn't cost me any money. So, whatever. A sociopath is different from a psychopath. A sociopath can still express empathy for individuals who are close to them, let's say, like family members. So they may rob a store and kill somebody because they needed bread for their family. They feel no remorse for having killed someone, but they did it because they didn't want to see their little brother hungry. So it's this sort of warped empathy, lack of empathy. Psychopath, on the other hand, has no feelings for anyone. They would watch their brother die as easily as they would watch some random person die. And then finally, authoritarianism. One of the things that's scary, and I'll be honest, one of the things that scares me is that several polls over the last year have indicated that Americans have become significantly more comfortable with the idea of an authoritarian leader. I don't think Americans are paying attention to history, where these individuals are. Having an individual come to power that has authoritarian tendencies is extraordinarily dangerous in terms of the cruelty, the damage that they can invoke. With power and resources, they can call on those things to just wreak havoc among populations that they want. Think Hitler. A third of Americans, when polled, don't believe that the Holocaust happened. The murder of about 6 million Jewish people during World War II. That's just extraordinary. The neo-Nazi movement is extraordinary in its ugliness. The fact that 30% of Americans say that that type of leadership is okay is terrifying because it opens the door to it occurring. And we may have been, it depends on who you read and what, data and so forth you look at. To some extent, we were relatively close to that occurring, a year ago or so. How close? Depends on who you listen to. Closer than 0%? Absolutely. As high as 100%? I don't think so. Definitely closer than we had ever been since I guess after the Civil War. So the extra features of malignant narcissism then is why Erich Fromm described it as the most evil of all disorders, just as a component of sadism. That there's the Machiavellianism, which is often referred to as the dark triad, and then adding sadism to those characteristics created the dark tetrad. And Erich Fromm then added the fifth essence of evil by saying that when you put those together in the right circumstances, you create this incredibly evil situation in person, the malignant narcissist. Okay, so I posted the couple papers for you folks to read. Since there are two papers, they don't have to be 300-400 words each. 200, 250, 300 words, something like that, a little shorter. One's on empathy and one's on grandiosity, as two substantial symptoms of pathological narcissism. And then, as I put in the instructions, pull out 3 articles on your own. Maybe any combination of 3. Want to do 3 on grandiosity? Fine by me. 3 on empathy? Fine by me. Combination, 2 on one on the other, doesn't matter. Just pick 3, like before, and summarize those as before. Okay? And I will see you Tuesday. Look at the announcements. In fact, I'll say it again now, because, to make sure that you're aware of it. There's an announcement that says that we've got a different room. Yay. Better, technology, and just a larger room, just easier, spread out more, just safer, more comfortable. And it's downstairs in 203. So instead of 304, 203. It's one of the larger rooms. So I think it'll be great. So I will see you there in main hall 203 on Tuesday. Have a great weekend and stay well.